The early morning sunlight streamed through Atlanta International Airport's towering windows, casting long shadows across Terminal B's polished floors. Captain Marcus Thompson moved with measured precision through the bustling corridor, his perfectly pressed uniform catching the golden rays. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence earned from 15 years of commercial flights, and before that, distinguished service as an Air Force combat pilot. His Rolex, a gift from his late father upon graduating from the Air Force Academy, showed 5:45 a.m. Perfect timing, as always. Marcus had never been late for a flight in his career, a streak he maintained with near-religious dedication. As he approached Gate B-23, he noticed the usual pre-boarding bustle, passengers shuffling travel documents, children clutching tablets, and business travelers tapping away at laptops. The first-class cabin of Flight UA 2547 to San Francisco was already beginning to fill with passengers. Marcus noticed the usual mix: a tech executive in a casual blazer, an elderly couple coordinating their overhead bin space, and a young woman in designer wear carefully placing her Hermes bag under the seat. The familiar scent of coffee and leather seats brought a slight smile to his face. This was home, more so than his empty apartment in Atlanta's Buckhead district. Sarah Chen, a flight attendant he didn't recognize, was helping a passenger stow a carry-on bag when she caught sight of him. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A subtle tightening around the eyes, a slight pause in her movements. Marcus had seen that look countless times before. It was the precursor to what he privately called the moment. "Sir," her voice carried across the cabin, clear and professional, but tinged with what she likely thought was authority. "Economy boarding isn't for another 20 minutes. I'll have to ask you to exit the aircraft and wait with the other passengers." The cabin's ambient noise didn't quite cease, but it diminished noticeably. A businessman lowered his Wall Street Journal. The elderly couple exchanged glances. A young girl tugged her mother's sleeve and whispered something. Marcus felt the weight of 24 pairs of eyes, some curious, others embarrassed, a few seemingly vindicated in their own hidden biases. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to his collar, where 4 gold stripes gleamed under the cabin lights. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Your response to ignorance defines you more than the ignorance itself." Standing at 6'2", Marcus could be intimidating if he chose to be. Instead, he maintained the calm demeanor that had served him well through thunderstorms at 35,000 feet and engine failures over the Pacific. "Miss Chen," he said, reading her name tag with deliberate care, "I appreciate your attention to procedure." His voice was smooth, educated, with just a trace of his Georgia upbringing. "However, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Sarah's eyes flickered to his stripes, then his face, then back to the stripes. Color began creeping up her neck. Behind her, a young man in seat 2C had already pulled out his phone, its camera lens glinting in the cabin light. This, too, was familiar, the modern impulse to document every potential confrontation, every possible viral moment. Marcus could have immediately pulled out his pilot's license and airline ID. He could have asserted his authority or called for the lead flight attendant. Instead, he did something that would later be described in thousands of social media posts as masterful. He smiled, not with condescension or anger, but with genuine warmth. "Would you mind if I asked you something?" he said, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "What was it about my appearance that made you assume I belonged in economy?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Sarah's eyes widened as the full impact of her actions began to register. The phone in 2C lowered slightly, its owner perhaps realizing he was witnessing something more significant than a viral confrontation. Marcus stood there, straight-backed and dignified, his captain's bars catching the light, waiting for an answer that would transform this moment from a potential scandal into something far more meaningful. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, probably a text from his co-pilot wondering where he was. But Marcus knew some moments required patience, required standing still in the uncomfortable silence until understanding could bloom. The next few seconds would determine whether this became just another incident of prejudice at 30,000 feet or something that might actually change hearts and minds. And Captain Marcus Thompson had learned long ago that altitude wasn't the only thing that required careful navigation. The silence that followed Marcus's question seemed to compress the air in the cabin. Sarah Chen's perfectly manicured hands fidgeted with her uniform scarf, her earlier confidence evaporating under the weight of her realization. The young man in 2C had completely lowered his phone now, seemingly understanding that he was witnessing something more profound than social media fodder. I just assumed, Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. She stopped, recognizing how damning those 3 words sounded in the hushed cabin. A few rows back, someone cleared their throat uncomfortably. Marcus reached into his jacket, his movements deliberately slow and measured. The tension in the cabin ratcheted up a notch, a sad commentary on modern times that even a uniformed pilot's movements could trigger anxiety. He retrieved his pilot's license and airline ID, but didn't immediately present them. Instead, he held them at his side, leather wallet close. "You know, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth as before, "I've been flying for nearly 2 decades. Started in the Air Force, flew combat missions over Afghanistan, and then moved to commercial aviation. In all those years, do you know what's never changed?" He paused, allowing his words to settle. "The sky doesn't care what color the pilot is. Neither do the physics that keep this aircraft aloft." A soft murmur rippled through the first-class cabin. The elderly couple who had been watching exchanged glances again, but this time with something like admiration. The tech executive had put down his laptop entirely, his attention fully captured by the unfolding scene. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "Captain, I am so sorry. I don't know why Marcus raised his hand gently, not to silence her, but to reshape the moment. "This isn't about an apology, Sarah. It's about something bigger." He finally opened his wallet, displaying his credentials. "Every time something like this happens, we have 2 choices. We can let it divide us further, or we can use it as a bridge to understanding." From the back of the first-class cabin, a new voice joined the conversation. "Excuse me, Captain." It was a teenage girl, maybe 15, her dark skin a shade lighter than Marcus's. She had been quietly watching the entire exchange. "I'm actually doing a project for school about barriers in professional fields. Would you mind if I asked you some questions after we land?" The tension in the cabin began to transform into something else, something that felt more like possibility. Marcus smiled at the teenager, then turned back to Sarah, who looked both mortified and transfixed. "See, sometimes our worst moments can lead to our most important conversations." He gestured toward the cockpit. "I usually do my pre-flight checks alone, but today, I'd like to invite you to join me, Sarah. Would you like to see exactly what it is I do up there?" The invitation hung in the air like a lifeline. Sarah's eyes widened, understanding the gesture for what it was, not just forgiveness, but an opportunity for growth. "Yes, Captain Thompson, I would like that very much." As they moved toward the cockpit, the teenage girl's mother touched Marcus's sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "My daughter wants to be a pilot, but lately she's been saying it seems impossible." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of this moment, how it would ripple out beyond this flight, beyond this day. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out one of his business cards. "Nothing's impossible," he said, handing it to the girl. "The sky's a big place. Room for everyone up there." The cabin had transformed. What had started as a moment of prejudice had become something else entirely. A lesson, a connection, a possibility. As Marcus led Sarah toward the cockpit, he could feel the shift in the air, the way understanding sometimes came not through confrontation, but through connection. His co-pilot, James Rivera, was already running through the pre-flight checklist when they entered. He raised an eyebrow at Sarah's presence, but said nothing, reading the situation with the intuition of a seasoned airman. "Ready for today's flight, Captain Thompson?" Sarah asked, her voice steady now, professional, but with a new note of genuine respect. Marcus settled into his seat, his hands finding their familiar places on the controls. "Sarah, I've been ready my entire life. Now, let me show you exactly what that means." The pre-flight check was nearly complete when the cabin door alarm chimed unexpectedly. Marcus and Sarah turned to see Jerry Williams, the lead flight attendant, rushing in with a concerned expression that quickly morphed into shock at the sight of Sarah in the cockpit. "Captain Thompson, I just heard," Jerry began, then stopped abruptly. His 20 years of experience had taught him to read situations quickly, and something about the calm atmosphere in the cockpit didn't match the urgent text he'd received about a situation with a black passenger in uniform. Before Jerry could continue, a commotion arose from the first-class cabin. Through the open cockpit door came the sound of someone speaking with the kind of authority that only decades of experience could convey. "Listen up, everyone," the voice boomed. "Since some of you are already filming this incident, let me give you something worth recording." Marcus recognized the speaker before he even turned around. William Bill Richardson, aged 96, one of the last surviving Tuskegee Airmen, who frequently flew this route to visit his grandchildren in San Francisco. The elderly man had risen from his seat, his weathered hands gripping the headrest in front of him, his eyes bright with the fire of someone who had fought too many battles to stay silent now. "That man you're all whispering about," Bill continued, his voice carrying years of both pain and triumph. "Captain Marcus Thompson didn't just graduate top of his class at the Air Force Academy. 3 years ago, when Flight 2473 lost all electrical power over the Rockies, it was his skill and courage that saved 256 lives." The cabin fell silent. Several passengers pulled out their phones, but this time they were Googling the incident. Sarah's face paled as she remembered the headlines. "I know something about being judged before you can prove yourself," Bill went on, straightening his back with pride. "In 1944, they said I couldn't fly a plane either, said it wasn't my place. Well, I flew 89 combat missions, and I'm standing here today because capability doesn't care about color." Marcus stepped out of the cockpit, deeply moved by this unexpected intervention. The two men's eyes met across the cabin, one at the twilight of his journey, the other still climbing to his cruising altitude. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've read about your missions. The red tails were the reason I believed I could fly." Bill smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "And now you're the reason that young lady back there believes she can fly." He nodded toward the teenage girl, who was frantically taking notes on her phone, her earlier project about barriers in professional fields suddenly taking on new life. Jerry, still standing by the cockpit door, had tears in his eyes. He'd worked enough flights to know magical moments when he saw them, and this was one for the logbooks. Sarah stepped forward, her earlier embarrassment transformed into determination. "Mr. Richardson, would you allow me to move you to the front row? I think everyone needs to hear your stories today." The old pilot's face crinkled into a warm smile. "Child, I've been waiting decades for someone to really listen." As Sarah helped Bill to his new seat, Marcus noticed something extraordinary happening throughout the cabin. Passengers were closing their laptops, removing their earbuds, leaning forward in their seats. The tech executive raised his hand like a schoolboy with a question. The elderly couple wiped tears from their eyes. The woman with the Hermes bag was quietly putting it away, suddenly seeming to understand its insignificance in the face of real importance. "Captain," Bill called out, "don't you have a plane to fly?" Marcus smiled, checking his father's watch. "Yes, sir. But I think we can spare a few minutes. Some lessons are worth a slight delay." Jerry quickly got on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored today to have 2 aviation heroes on board. We'll be running about 15 minutes behind schedule, but I promise you, What you're about to hear is worth far more than those 15 minutes. As Marcus returned to the cockpit to finish his pre-flight checks, he could hear Bill beginning his story. It was 1943, and they told us black men couldn't handle anything more complicated than a mop. The cabin fell into a reverent hush, the kind that falls when history steps out of textbooks and takes a seat in first class, ready to teach lessons that no classroom could contain. As Flight UA 2547 climbed through the cloud layer, Bill Richardson's voice continued to captivate the first-class cabin. His stories flowed seamlessly from the prejudices of 1943 to the triumph of proving excellence knows no color. Marcus listened through the cockpit door, each word resonating with his own experiences, while his hands moved confidently across the controls. "Weather looks clear to San Francisco," co-pilot James Rivera reported, then added more quietly, "though I'd say the atmosphere back there has already cleared considerably." Marcus nodded, remembering his own journey. "Sometimes the best navigation happens on the ground," he replied, adjusting their altitude to 36,000 feet. In the cabin, Bill had reached the part of his story that always drew gasps. "We flew escort for bombers that didn't want us there," his voice carried clearly. "White pilots who'd requested any escort except the red tails. But after we proved ourselves, after we never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters, those same pilots specifically requested us. Excellence has a way of changing minds." Sarah, standing nearby with fresh coffee for the cockpit crew, found herself blinking back tears. She thought of her earlier assumption about Marcus, how quickly she jumped to judgment. The coffee pot trembled slightly in her hands. Just then, the teen girl, whose name they'd learned was Jasmine, raised her hand. "Mr. Richardson, sir, did you ever feel like giving up when people treated you badly?" Bill's laughter was warm and genuine. "Give up? Child, let me tell you about giving up." He gestured toward the cockpit. "Captain Thompson up there knows this too. When you're flying, giving up isn't an option. You push through the storm, navigate the turbulence, and keep your eyes on the horizon. Life's no different." Marcus took this moment to click on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at 36,000 feet, and while our weather radar shows clear skies ahead, I'm picking up something even clearer, the sound of wisdom being shared. Mr. Richardson's presence on this flight reminds us that the path to the cockpit was paved by pioneers who refused to accept artificial limitations." The cabin fell silent, hanging on his every word. Even the businessman who'd been sneaking glances at his phone tucked it away. "Some of you witnessed our interaction during boarding," Marcus continued, his voice steady and warm. "What you're seeing now, this conversation, this sharing of history and hope, this is how we rise above. Not through anger or division, but through understanding and excellence." Sarah, who had finally made her way to the cockpit with the coffee, stood straighter. She'd been dreading facing Marcus again, but his words gave her courage. As she handed him his cup, she spoke softly but clearly. "Captain Thompson, I'd like to share something with the passengers too, if that's allowed." Marcus studied her face for a moment, then nodded, handing her the intercom mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sarah Chen." Her voice wavered slightly before finding its strength. "This morning, I made a mistake born of unconscious bias, but what I've witnessed since then, the grace of Captain Thompson, the wisdom of Mr. Richardson, the dreams of young Jasmine, has taught me more than any training session ever could." From his seat, Bill Richardson's eyes twinkled. "Now that's what I call flying high," he commented, causing ripples of appreciative laughter throughout the cabin. The tech executive, who hadn't touched his laptop for the past hour, raised his hand. "Mr. Richardson, Captain Thompson, I'm on the board of a STEM education foundation. Would you both be willing to speak at our next youth conference?" Before either could answer, Jasmine's mother spoke up. "I'm a high school counselor. Our students need to hear these stories too." Marcus smiled, hearing the cascade of opportunities unfolding behind him. What had started as a moment of prejudice was transforming into a platform for change. He thought of his father's words again about responses defining character, understanding now that they could define not just moments, but movements. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the intercom one more time, "some flights are measured in miles. Others are measured in milestones. Today, we're flying both." As the plane cruised westward, the cabin buzzed with conversation, connection, and possibility. Sometimes, Marcus realized, the most important journeys weren't marked on any map, and the most significant distances covered weren't measured in nautical miles, but in the spaces between human hearts. 3 hours into the flight, the calm atmosphere that had settled over the cabin was suddenly disrupted. The plane shuddered, causing drinks to slosh and passengers to grip their armrests. Marcus's trained eyes quickly scanned the weather radar, which had unexpectedly lit up with a massive storm cell that hadn't been there minutes ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice came over the intercom, steady despite the increasing turbulence. "This is Captain Thompson. We've encountered some unexpected weather. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately." Sarah, who had been in the middle of serving lunch to Bill Richardson, quickly secured the meal trays. The old veteran reached out and steadied her hand as the plane took another sharp dip. "Reminds me of flying through flak over Germany," he said, his voice carrying a hint of both memory and mischief. "Though I suspect Captain Thompson has better instruments than my old P-51. In the cockpit, Marcus and James worked in perfect synchronization, their hands dancing across the controls as they navigated through the rapidly deteriorating conditions. The storm had formed with unusual speed, creating what meteorologists call a powder keg situation. "Air traffic control," Marcus radioed, his voice professional and controlled. "This is United 2547. Requesting immediate deviation 20 degrees south to avoid severe weather system." As they waited for clearance, Marcus could hear the murmur of nervous passengers through the cockpit door. He thought quickly, remembering how his father used to calm him during storms. Clicking on the intercom again, he began to speak, his voice warm and reassuring. "Folks, I want to share something my grandmother used to tell me during thunderstorms. She'd say, 'Marcus, sometimes the bumpiest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations. Right now, we're experiencing nature's version of a bumpy road, but I promise you, we're in good hands.'" The plane jerked again, more violently this time. In first class, Jasmine let out a small yelp of fear. Bill Richardson, still as calm as if he were sitting in his living room, turned to her with a gentle smile. "Young lady," he called out, his voice carrying over the storm's rumble, "did you know that the Tuskegee Airmen flew through worse than this with half the technology? And did you know your captain up there once landed a plane with complete electrical failure? A little turbulence is just nature's way of keeping us humble." Sarah, now secured in her jump seat, watched in amazement as Bill's words seemed to calm not just Jasmine, but the surrounding passengers as well. The same people who had been filming the earlier confrontation were now nodding along, finding strength in the veteran's unwavering confidence. Back in the cockpit, Marcus and James finally received clearance for their deviation. As they began their turn, Marcus thought about the symbolism of the moment, how sometimes the path forward required a willingness to adjust course, to find new ways through old challenges. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the same warmth it had during the morning's confrontation, "we're executing a slight course correction to take us around the worst of this weather. Sometimes in flight, as in life, the best path isn't always the straightest one." The tech executive, who had been quietly observing everything since the morning's events, turned to Bill. "Sir," he said, having to raise his voice slightly over the storm, "I'm starting to think this entire flight is one big metaphor for progress." Bill's laughter rang out, somehow both soft and powerful enough to cut through the cabin noise. "Son, everything's a metaphor if you're paying attention. The real question is what you do with the lesson." As the plane emerged from the worst of the turbulence into calmer skies, Sarah made her way back through the cabin, checking on passengers. When she reached Jasmine, She found the teenager furiously writing in her notebook. "What are you working on?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Jasmine looked up, her eyes bright with purpose. "I'm changing my school project. It's not just about barriers anymore. It's about how we break through them, together." The sun broke through the clouds ahead, sending rays of light streaming through the cabin windows. Marcus's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Folks, we've cleared the rough patch. Sometimes the best view comes right after the storm." In first class, Bill Richardson nodded approvingly. "Now that," he said to no one in particular, "is how you pilot through turbulence, both in the air and on the ground." As Flight UA 2547 began its descent into San Francisco International Airport, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The earlier turbulence had faded into memory, replaced by a sense of collective experience that had transformed a cabin full of strangers into something closer to family. Sarah stood at her station, preparing for landing, when she noticed her hands trembling slightly. The day's events washed over her, her morning prejudice, the grace with which it was met, the shared terror of turbulence, and now, the impending farewell. She felt a gentle tap on her shoulder and turned to find Bill Richardson's knowing gaze. "Guilt's a heavy bag to carry," he said softly, having left his seat despite the seatbelt sign. "But growth, that's the kind of baggage worth keeping." "Sir, you should really be seated for landing," she managed, her professional training mooring with the moment. "I've landed through German anti-aircraft fire, child. I think I can manage a few more minutes," he chuckled, then grew serious. "But there's something you need to hear before we touch down." From the cockpit, Marcus's voice came over the intercom, beginning the final descent announcement. Bill waited until it finished, then continued. "You know, back in '44, we had this white mechanic who refused to service our planes. Said he wouldn't be responsible for colored pilots. 3 weeks later, we saved his son's bomber squadron over Berlin." Sarah felt tears welling up. Did he change? Changed so much he came to every Tuskegee reunion until the day he died. Bill smiled. His granddaughter's an Air Force pilot now. Change isn't just about one moment. It's about all the moments that follow. In the cockpit, Marcus was guiding the aircraft down through the Bay Area's notorious evening crosswinds with practiced ease. James handled the radio communications while stealing glances at his captain, still amazed by how the day had unfolded. "You know," James said during a quiet moment, "my daughter wants to be a pilot. After today, I'm going to tell her about this flight." Marcus nodded, adjusting their approach angle. "Tell her about Sarah, too," he said. "Sometimes the most important lessons come from watching someone else learn them." Back in the cabin, Jasmine had her phone ready, recording the sunset through the window while narrating quietly. "Day 1 of my new project. How prejudice gets grounded. Today I learned that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments." The tech executive, overhearing, paused in his email composition. He'd been drafting a proposal to his board about expanding their STEM program to include aviation training for underrepresented youth. The subject line read, "The Richardson-Thompson Initiative." As the landing gear deployed with a reassuring thunk, Sarah made one final pass through the cabin. Each passenger she'd been serving all day now felt like a witness to her journey. The elderly couple smiled warmly. The woman with the Hermes bag, who'd been so absorbed in her phone that morning, was now deeply engaged in conversation with Jasmine's mother about educational advocacy. Marcus's voice came over the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. The local time is 5:47 p.m. As we end this journey together, I'm reminded that every flight path has its turbulence, every course needs its corrections, and every landing brings new beginnings." The plane touched down smoothly, drawing appreciative murmurs from the passengers. As they taxied to the gate, Bill Richardson stood up despite Sarah's half-hearted protests. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice commanded attention without requiring volume. "Today we've witnessed more than a flight. We've seen how prejudice can be transformed by grace, how mistakes can become stepping stones, and how the journey forward requires all of us to navigate together. The cabin erupted in applause as the aircraft came to a complete stop. Sarah, fighting back tears, grabbed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of our entire crew, especially Captain Thompson, thank you for joining us on what has become much more than just a flight from Atlanta to San Francisco." As passengers began gathering their belongings, Sarah caught Marcus emerging from the cockpit. Their eyes met, and in that moment, she understood that some journeys don't end with a landing. They're just beginning. 2 weeks after the memorable flight from Atlanta to San Francisco, Marcus Thompson sat in his home office, staring at his computer screen in disbelief. The video of the incident, captured by multiple passengers, had gone viral, but not in the way such confrontations usually did. Instead of angry comments and divisive arguments, the comment sections were filled with stories of personal transformation and calls for change. "Did you see the latest?" his sister Maya texted. She'd attached a link to a major news network's website where the headline read, "Airlines implement Thompson protocol for handling bias incidents." Marcus leaned back in his chair, remembering his father's words about responses defining character. He couldn't have anticipated how his response that day would ripple through the aviation industry. His phone buzzed again, this time an email from Sarah Chen. "Captain Thompson, the diversity training program I mentioned is taking off. 26 airlines have already adopted it. But more importantly, I wanted to share something personal. Yesterday, a young black pilot candidate came through our training center. When he saw me, he tensed up, expecting the worst. Instead, I shared our story. By the end of the day, he was teaching me about his journey to the cockpit. Change really does start with one moment, doesn't it?" Sarah. As he finished reading, his doorbell rang. Opening it, he found Jasmine and her mother standing there, holding what appeared to be a school project. "I got an A+, Jasmine beamed, handing him a beautifully crafted presentation board titled, "Breaking Barriers at 36,000 Feet, How One Flight Changed Many Lives." The board featured news clippings, social media posts, and interviews with passengers from the flight. But what caught Marcus's eye was the centerpiece, a series of photographs showing Bill Richardson speaking to a packed auditorium of young aviation students. "Mr. Richardson has been busy," Jasmine's mother explained. "After that tech executive set up the foundation, Bill's been speaking at schools across the country. He says he's got decades of wisdom stored up, and it's time to share it all." Marcus invited them in, and as they settled in his living room, his phone rang again. It was James Rivera, his co-pilot from that day. "Captain, you need to check your email right now," James said, excitement evident in his voice. "The airline's board just approved the mentorship program. They're calling it Horizons Unlimited. Your idea about pairing experienced pilots with underprivileged kids who dream of flying. It's happening." As Marcus pulled up the email, Jasmine was showing him something on her tablet, a social media movement sparked by their flight. The hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack had been transformed from a tag of frustration to one of empowerment, filled with stories of black pilots and aviation professionals sharing their journeys. But here's the best part. Jasmine scrolled to a particular post. It was from the woman with the Hermes bag, who'd been so disconnected that morning of the flight. She'd shared a photo of herself with her daughter at a small airport, both wearing aviation headsets. The caption read, "Teaching my daughter that the sky's the limit isn't just a saying anymore. Thank you, Captain Thompson, for showing us what real leadership looks like." The tech executive had made good on his promise too. His foundation had already awarded 50 flight training scholarships to minority students, with Bill Richardson serving as honorary chairman of the selection committee. Marcus's house phone rang. One of the few people who had that number was Bill himself. "Turn on CNN," the veteran pilot said without preamble. "They're doing a segment on how that flight changed corporate training policies across industries. Sarah's being interviewed." Sure enough, there was Sarah on national television, poised and professional, discussing how one incident had sparked a revolution in how companies handle bias training. "We've moved beyond PowerPoint presentations," she was saying. "Now we're focusing on real stories, real changes, and real results." As they watched, Jasmine pulled out her notebook. "I've decided," she announced. "I'm not just going to be a pilot. I'm going to be the kind of pilot who changes things, like you and Mr. Richardson." Marcus smiled, remembering his own journey from that first dream of flight to where he sat now. On his desk sat a framed photo taken at the gate after landing in San Francisco. The entire first-class cabin, crew, and Bill Richardson, all standing together, united by something more powerful than altitude. His father's watch caught the afternoon light, reminding him that sometimes the most important timekeeping wasn't about hours and minutes, but about moments that shift the course of many lives. 6 months after the flight that changed everything, San Francisco International Airport's largest conference room was filled to capacity. The occasion, the inaugural ceremony of the Richardson-Thompson Aviation Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to transform the aviation industry's approach to diversity and inclusion. Marcus stood at the podium, surveying the crowd. In the front row sat Bill Richardson, now officially appointed as the program's honorary chairman, his chest adorned with medals that caught the light. Beside him was Sarah Chen, recently promoted to Chief of Diversity Training across all United Airlines operations. Jasmine and her mother were there too, the teenager now sporting a flight school jacket with freshly earned wings pinned to the collar. "When I walked onto that flight 6 months ago," Marcus began, his voice carrying the same steady warmth it had that day, "I was just doing my job. But sometimes, the most important flight plans are the ones we never saw coming." The screen behind him displayed statistics that drew murmurs from the crowd. Over 500 minority students enrolled in flight training programs through their scholarships. 43 airlines had adopted the new bias response protocols. Complaint rates about discrimination had dropped by 67% across participating carriers. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," Marcus continued. "Change isn't just about statistics. It's about moments, choices, and the courage to believe in something better." He gestured to Sarah, who joined him at the podium. Gone was the uncertain flight attendant from that day. In her place stood a confident leader who had turned her mistake into a movement. 6 months ago, I made an assumption that could have ended very differently," Sarah addressed the crowd. "Instead, it became the catalyst for the most comprehensive overhaul of airline staff training in decades. We don't just talk about bias anymore, we transform it." The tech executive, now a major donor to their initiative, stepped up next. "When I witnessed what happened on that flight, I saw more than a problem. I saw a solution. Today, we're not just funding dreams, we're funding the future of aviation." Jasmine took the stage next, her voice strong and clear. "My school project about barriers turned into something bigger. We created a nationwide network of young aviators of color. We call ourselves the New Horizons, and we're just getting started." The crowd erupted in applause as Bill Richardson made his way to the podium, helped by Marcus. The veteran's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "In 1943, they said we couldn't fly." His voice carried decades of history. "In 2024, we're not just flying. We're helping others soar. Captain Thompson, Sarah, all of you. You've taken what we started and carried it higher than we ever dreamed possible." Marcus returned to the microphone for the ceremony's culmination. "Today, we're announcing the extension of our initiative to include maintenance training, air traffic control programs, and aerospace engineering scholarships. The sky isn't the limit anymore. It's just the beginning." As he spoke, the back doors opened. Dozens of young aviation students filed in, each wearing the blue uniforms of their flight training program. They lined the walls of the conference room, a living testimony to the change one flight had sparked. "But perhaps the most important announcement," Marcus continued, "is that starting next month, every commercial flight in America will include a brief message about aviation's diverse history and future. When passengers buckle their seatbelts, they'll also open their minds." Sarah stepped forward again, this time holding something covered in blue velvet. She unveiled a plaque that would hang in every major airport in the country. It read, "The sky knows no color, no gender, no limitations. Neither should we." The ceremony concluded with an unexpected moment. Jasmine, now a student pilot, presented Marcus with her first set of wings. "You showed me they were possible," she said simply. As the crowd dispersed for the reception, Bill Richardson caught Marcus's arm. "You know what the best part is, son?" the veteran asked with a smile. "This isn't the end of the story. It's just the first chapter." Marcus nodded, watching as Sarah led a group of new flight attendants through their revised training protocol, as Jasmine showed her logbook to aspiring young pilots, as the tech executive discussed expansion plans with airline executives. His father's watch still kept perfect time on his wrist, but Marcus knew some moments couldn't be measured in hours and minutes. They could only be measured in lives changed, barriers broken, and horizons expanded. Above the airport, a United Airlines flight took off into the evening sky. In its wake flew something more powerful than jet fuel. The knowledge that sometimes the most important destinations aren't found on any map, but in the hearts and minds of those brave enough to make the journey.